And joining me now on the Boardwalk Honda hotline is Dave Isaac of the Courier Post, who got to get a early flight in here because of the weather after that game in Detroit last night. Dave, how you doing this afternoon?
Doing good, Josh. How you doing?
Doing well. So last night, a lot of different things to take away from the game last night. You know, on one hand, it was good to see them be able to jumpstart the offense, get it back to the overtime, but it feels a little almost empty-hearted. You get left with 1 point, but it's still, you feel a little empty because you knew they could have won that game in overtime, but if it wasn't for a couple saves by Alex Lyon, they might not have got there in the first place.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, when you look at the first 40 minutes of that game, the Flyers really just put it in autopilot and really didn't have anything close to their best effort. I mean, that's a fragile team that lost 10 straight. The Flyers know what that feeling is like. They really could have come out and put their foot on the gas in the Motor City, and they really didn't. They had no business winning that game if you look at the first 40 minutes of it, but then they flipped the switch in the third period and almost stole the thing. So as frustrating as it is to see them only get 1 point, they really didn't deserve it all.
This isn't the first time Alex Lyon has been thrust into duty in the middle of a game. We saw it in the Rangers game earlier this year. We've seen it now, a couple times now for Mrazek now. So, you know, what are your impressions about how Hakstol has been handling the goaltender situation, and also your thoughts on how Lyon has handled being thrust in there in such late notice in a game?
Yeah, it's really impressive what Alex Lyon has done in terms of going in for mop-up duty and going in cold. There's really, and Dave Hakstol talked about this the other day, such a small margin of error when you get put into that situation. The team, when you're changing goalies, the team is already down unless you're changing for an injury. So you really can't afford to give up another one. Lyon did give up one, but at that point the Flyers had already come back and tied the game. So he's really done everything that the Flyers could have asked of him in really difficult situations. In terms of how Dave Hakstol has handled the goalie situation as a whole, look, Ron Hextall went out and got Peter Mrazek for this situation, and he's coming up really small. I don't know how many more times Hakstol can keep going to Mrazek, but this is why they got him. So, you know, I have a hard time blaming Dave Hakstol for putting Mrazek out there in what's supposed to be a big game, and it was an especially meaningful one for Mrazek, too, going back to Detroit, the only team he had ever known, the team that traded him to Philadelphia. So he certainly should have been up for that game. And I think the first two goals were definitely stoppable. The second one was just flat out bad. And the third one he gave up was the third one in 4 minutes. And I think that's why, more than anything, the Flyers made the goalie change. But that one was the least on him out of the three. But they definitely need more from him down the stretch here. That being said, I don't think he'll play tomorrow. I would think that kind of a reward for what he did yesterday, Alex Lyon will get the start against the New York Rangers tomorrow.
You know, Lyon has played well, especially since that Rangers game when he came in relief. And I have to wonder, how has his play earned him not just a spot on the team for the rest of this season, because we know that eventually Neuwirth and Elliott may be back, but how does that affect his future with the team next year?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see because he only signed a 1-year deal. So he's going to be a restricted free agent at the end of the season here. And as you mentioned, Michael Neuwirth is kind of knocking on the door here. I think he's kind of in day-to-day territory now. I don't think he'll go tomorrow, but it wouldn't surprise me if he was at least dressed for the game. I guess it's Sunday, so they play Thursday, then Sunday in Pittsburgh. And that would be a difficult one to throw him into also just because of the quality of the opponent. But you kind of weigh all the options there out of the three, if indeed Neuwirth is healthy enough to go at that point. And it'll be interesting to see what Dave Hakstol does there. I think that with the way that Neuwirth had played before he got hurt, it just seems like every time the going gets tough, Michael Neuwirth goes on injured reserve. So I think that he really doesn't have the team's trust for that reason. And part of me would be surprised if they did put him back in, but I'm not so sure. With these guys, it's really tough to tell. But I think Alex Lyon at this point, with what he's done, has kind of earned the opportunity over Michael Neuwirth, even though he doesn't have as much experience.
And it's interesting because with the 8 games left in the season, you look at the standings right now. If I understand the standings right, the season ended today. The Flyers would play the Capitals, and the last time the Flyers were in the playoffs, it was Neuberth who helped extend that series. So, is that maybe something in the back of the Flyers' mind that as well, if we do match up with the Capitals, we have a guy in Neuberth who the last time we faced him in the playoffs, he did get hot for a few games.
Yeah, I'm sure that's part of the Flyers' line of thinking, and that certainly seems to have been, personal history against other teams and matchups and stuff like that certainly seems to have lent itself to Dave Haxtell's line of thinking. Even if you look back to last night, and the Flyers ended up going in the shootout. I think Nolan Patrick had won a shootout. I think it was against Arizona on the road, but because he had some success recently in a shootout, he ends up going with Nolan Patrick. Now, I think that one way or another, you need to get Claude Giroux in that shootout, but I think that was Dave Haxtell's way of saying, the kid did well for us in a shootout one of the last times out, so going to go with him again. I definitely think that personal matchups play a big role into what Dave Haxtell thinks and the decisions that he makes.
Speaking of Claude Giroux, before we get to him directly, the shootout, I understand Voracek. Voracek's got so much stick skills that you have to have him in a shootout most of the time. But I was very surprised to see both Wheel and Patrick out there and not Claude Giroux. And, after the game, Flyers Twitter had a hissy fit about it. People on different media outlets were losing their minds. So, you mentioned the personal matchups. What else went into, do you believe, Giroux not being out there? Was it just the matchups, or was it just also he liked Wheel and Patrick in that situation?
I think it's a combination of that, and as much as Claude Giroux has been the Flyers' best player, his statistics this year in the shootout have not been good. I think he's 0 for 6, if I'm not mistaken. I still would have put him out there, like I said, but I think that was probably what went into Dave Haxtell's line of thinking in that scenario.
You wrote an article at the Courier Post. I was reading at the Courier Post online.com about Claude Giroux, and you were talking about how Giroux is doing his part to help the Flyers in their playoff push. And I mentioned this about a month ago. Giroux is just climbing up these Flyers all-time charts. He's already passed Lindros now for the 5th most points in Flyers history. He's already in the top 5 in assists. He's going to be knocking on the door soon to be in the top 10 in goals. He's already in the top 10 in games played as well. So he is really cementing himself in the history of the Flyers organization. Do you think Giroux gets enough credit for the kind of career he's had in a Flyers uniform?
That's a tough one. I'm not sure if he gets enough credit. I mean, like you said, the fact that his name is starting to appear on a lot of these lists, I think, should garner him a lot of credit for that. But if you look at the last couple of years, coming into this year, he was on a statistical decline each of the last 3 years. So this is kind of a, not reclamation project, but certainly almost like turning back the clock and seeing the Claude Giroux of 3-4 years ago when he had 93 points in what was his best season ever. And there's still a little bit of time left for him to match that number or maybe even surpass it. But I think it's kind of like when you talk about players when their careers are over and are they worthy of Hall of Fames, you look for the championships, you look for the big games. And the Flyers have only gotten past the first round with Claude Giroux, I believe, once. And that was the year that they went to the Stanley Cup Finals, and he was in his 2nd or 3rd year in the league. So, I think that if he has a little bit more left in him, if his tank isn't empty and he can put up 2-3 more years like he's got this year, then I think he'll get all the credit in the world.
Yeah, because he's only 32 years old. He's by far not exactly old. 30 years old, right? In terms of,
yeah,
but he's not old in terms of hockey terms. He's maybe not in the elite part of his prime, but he's still near the top of his game, if not at the top of his game right now. So, like you said, he still probably could get 2 more really good years out of him. To me, I look at all the other guys who have gotten past 30 and still have had very productive careers as they've gone on. And I think in many ways that Giroux has the chance to still be a very good player. What is the time frame? You mentioned the 2 years, but beyond those 2 years, How long do you think the Flyers as an organization, considering all the youth they have coming up through the system, how long do you think they stick with Claude Giroux, not just as one of their top linesmen, but as the captain, considering all the youth they have coming up behind him?
Well, I think that in terms of changing the captaincy, that's not something that you typically do unless that player is done or is out of here. So, the last couple captains, Mike Richards, and then he got traded, and it was Chris Pronger, and then it became clear that Chris Pronger wasn't going to be able to play another game in the NHL again, and they ended up giving it to Claude Giroux for that reason. So I don't think that they're in a scenario where they think that Claude Giroux is going to end up in his twilight years, and let's just give it to Nolan Patrick because it's looking like it's about to be his time. I think that you let a player like Giroux, who's had it for quite a while, keep it until he's done in whatever way that means, whether it's a trade in the last year of his contract or he ends up retiring a Flyer, whatever the case may be. I think that he's one of those kinds of players where you just let him keep it. He's had it this long. And there were so many detractors that wanted to strip him of the captaincy, which was just ludicrous. But I think that you have it for a certain amount of time, and it's like, well, there's no turning back now. You're not going to take it off of his sweater at this point.
Dave, one more for you, and I appreciate the time here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. Flyers 86 points heading down the stretch, only a handful of games to go. What is your expectation of where they may be able to end up in the standings here?
I think it would still take a pretty big collapse for them to not make the playoffs. That being said, they still have to take care of business as well. I mean, they have to win some of these games. They can't just put it in autopilot and look ahead to April 11th when the playoffs start. Things are still so tight. I mean, look, the other day I was booking hotels just so that I could have some options available and good pricing when the playoffs come around, and I booked in 3 different cities. It's really difficult to tell what's going to be the end result here for the Flyers. And if they stay where they are now, like you mentioned earlier, it would be the Washington Capitals. I don't think they'll end up in this in the bottom wild card spot and play Tampa in the first round. I don't think they'll end up falling that far. I think they'll get their act together at least a little bit and get in either the seed that they're in now, which is the top wild card, or the 3 seed, which if you look at the picture right now, they would be not the home ice team in a series against the Pittsburgh Penguins.
Follow him on Twitter at Dave G. Isaac. Does a great job for the Courier Post, and definitely check out his article about the Claude Giroux at the CourierPostOnline.com. Great stuff as always, Dave. Always appreciate the time, and hopefully you can stay warm and get some rest for the next game here.
All right. Thanks for having me, Josh.